He slid the room key across the restaurant table like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. Dominic Valenti, the man whose name made grown men lower their eyes in crowded rooms, looked at Vivian Locke the way a king looks at a prize he's already claimed. Unhurried. Certain. A half smile pulling at the corner of his mouth while his wedding ring caught the candlelight, and neither of them bothered to look away from it. 12 years of marriage. A woman waiting at home. And he ordered the Barolo like it was any other Tuesday. What Dominic didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in his most paranoid hour, was that the woman he'd been lying to for over a year already knew everything. And she had been waiting for exactly the right moment to make him understand what that word actually meant. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay with me. This one is for you. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you feel something watching this, leave a like. It tells me you were here. Now, let's get into it. The first thing you need to understand about Dominic Valenti is that he was not born dangerous. He became dangerous the way most men in his world do, slowly, then all at once through a series of choices that each felt necessary at the time and only revealed their true cost in the accounting that came much later. He grew up in South Brooklyn in a house where the lights sometimes went out because his father prioritized other things over the electric bill, and where the word legitimate was used the way other families used the word fantasy, not with contempt exactly, just with a particular kind of tired pragmatism that comes from watching honest work fail too many times to keep pretending it was the only option. By 22, he was running errands for the Valenti crew, not his family by blood, but a family in every way that mattered to a young man with something to prove. By 27, he had proven it. By 30, he had proven it so thoroughly that the man whose name was on the door handed it to him instead, not because Dominic demanded it, but because the old man looked at him across a dinner table one night and said quietly, "You already run it. Might as well sign for it." That was the thing about Dominic that people who only feared him never understood. He was genuinely intelligent. Not educated, he'd never finished 2 consecutive semesters of anything, but intelligent in the way that counts, in rooms where diplomas don't get you anything, and reading people correctly keeps you breathing. He could walk into a negotiation, and within 4 minutes identify who in the room was lying, who was scared, and who was trying too hard not to look like either. He had a memory for details that most people would consider irrelevant. He noticed when a man changed his watch. He noticed when someone's handshake had less pressure than the last time. He noticed everything, which was why, later, the thing with Celeste would haunt him the way it did. Because he had never once, in 12 years, truly noticed her. He met Celeste Arden at a fundraiser he attended, only because his attorney told him it was the kind of event powerful men were expected to show up at, smile through, and leave with a few business cards and a charitable donation receipt. She was standing near the windows on the east side of the venue, tall, composed, wearing something dark and understated in a room full of women who had worn everything loud and shining. She wasn't performing. That was the first thing he registered about her, even if he couldn't have articulated it then. Everyone else in the room was performing something: generosity, importance, beauty, connection. Celeste Arden was simply standing there, holding a glass of water with a thin slice of lemon, watching the room with the calm attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what she was seeing. He introduced himself. She already knew who he was. She didn't say so, but he could tell, not by nervousness, which was what he was used to, but by the complete absence of it. She looked at him the way you look at something you've studied, not something that surprises you. "What do you do?" he asked her, because it was the natural question. "I manage investments," she said. "For a firm?" "For myself, mostly." He found that interesting. He also found her interesting, which was less common than it sounds. Most people became predictable to Dominic within the first 5 minutes of conversation. Celeste had a quality he would spend years trying to name, a kind of density, like there was more happening behind her eyes than she had any intention of showing. He asked for her number before they'd finished the conversation. She gave it to him without any of the performance that usually surrounded that moment. They were married 14 months later. The early years were genuinely good. That matters because the story doesn't make sense without it. This wasn't a marriage that was broken from the beginning. Dominic brought her into a world she understood was complicated, and she never pretended otherwise. She didn't ask questions she knew he wouldn't answer. She didn't push against walls she understood were load-bearing. She ran their home with a quiet competence that freed him to focus on the empire he was building, and she did it without ever making him feel managed, which was a skill more sophisticated than anything his lieutenants possessed. What Dominic mistook for contentment was in fact patience. What he mistook for disinterest was in fact observation. And what he mistook for loyalty was something far more complex, a woman who had married him with full knowledge of what he was, who had genuinely loved him for a while, and who had also, somewhere in the middle years, begun building something entirely her own because she understood, with the clear-eyed intelligence she'd had since before he met her, that a man like Dominic Valenti would eventually need to be saved from himself. She just hadn't decided yet whether she would be the one to do it. Vivian Locke entered the picture on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago. She came recommended by 3 different people by Dominic trusted, which was already a rare thing. She was a strategist, the kind, who looked at a struggling company and found the thing that was quietly bleeding it out, then designed the tourniquet. She was good at her job in a way that was immediately, practically visible, which Dominic valued above almost everything else. She didn't talk about what she was going to do. She did it and then showed him the numbers. He hired her without hesitation. The other thing, the personal thing, came later. Dominic would tell himself, if he was honest, that it crept up on him. That it was the late nights and the particular kind of pressure that makes proximity feel like inevitability. He wouldn't be entirely lying. But he also wouldn't be entirely telling the truth, because the reality was simpler and uglier than inevitability. He stopped thinking about consequences. He stopped asking himself what Celeste would think. He stopped, somewhere in the middle of building an empire and managing a crisis, and telling himself he deserved a release valve, treating his marriage like it was something that required his active care. Celeste noticed the first shift before he made it. She noticed it, the way she noticed everything quietly, without announcement, filing the information away, with the patience of someone who understood that the full picture hadn't developed yet. She was right. Within 4 months of Vivian joining the organization, Dominic was lying about where he spent his evenings. The thing nobody tells you about a secret is that keeping it requires a kind of constant low-level performance that slowly exhausts the person performing it. Dominic had kept serious secrets his entire adult life, the kind that carried real consequences, the kind that law enforcement spent careers trying to uncover. But this secret was different in a way he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. The business secrets lived in a part of his brain that had been trained and reinforced over decades. They had their compartments. They had their protocols. This one lived somewhere closer to the surface, in the part of him that still had to sit across from Celeste at dinner and ask how her day had been and listen to her answer. He told himself she didn't notice. He told himself that because the alternative that she noticed and simply chose not to say anything implied a level of composure that he wasn't ready to face. He was right that she noticed. He was catastrophically wrong about why she was silent. Celeste had known for 11 months before the restaurant. She found out the way careful women usually find out, not through dramatic discovery, but through the slow accumulation of small inconsistencies that a person who pays attention cannot help but see. A shift in his schedule she couldn't account for. A particular care in how he silenced his phone around her. The way he'd stopped reaching for her hand at the kinds of dinners where he used to reach for it automatically, as if the habit had been interrupted, and he had it remembered to. She didn't hire anyone. She didn't need to. By that point in her life, Celeste Arden had built an information network that most intelligence professionals would have respected, and she had built it for business reasons that had nothing to do with her husband. But information is information. When she decided she needed to know, she knew within a week. and then she sat with it. That was the part that would have undone Dominic if he'd known. Not the knowing, the sitting with it. The way she went about her days, managed her portfolio, attended meetings, smiled at the right moments in the right rooms, planted another flat of those blue wildflowers along the garden wall, while carrying the full weight of what she knew and deciding with great deliberateness what she was going to do about it. She wasn't indifferent. Anyone who assumed that didn't understand the cost of what she was doing. There were nights when she sat in the garden, after Dominic thought she was asleep, and felt the particular grief of a woman who has loved someone for a long time and watched them choose, repeatedly and knowingly, to be less than she believed they could be. It was a specific kind of sorrow, not the sharp crack of betrayal in the first moment, but the long ache of confirmation, of having suspected something about a person and having that suspicion proven right, and having to mourn both the proof and the hope that had preceded it. But Celeste Arden was not a woman who made decisions from grief. She made decisions from clarity, and clarity told her that the affair, while personally devastating, was actually the least complicated of the problems she had recently uncovered. Because there was something else happening inside the Valenti organization. Something that had begun before Vivian, before the affair, before any of this, something that had been building in the dark places of Dominic's empire for years, while he was too confident in the people around him to look carefully enough. Celeste had seen it first in numbers. She hadn't been looking for it, exactly. She'd been doing what she always did, running models on the legitimate side of the Valenti businesses, the ones she'd quietly and carefully begun analyzing, because she had a gift for seeing financial architecture and an interest in understanding the full structure of the world she lived in. What she found, buried under layers of restructured contracts and inflated invoices, and a shell company that required 3 different sets of financial records to trace, was the outline of a systematic theft. Someone inside Dominic's closest circle was bleeding the legitimate businesses. Slowly, carefully, professionally. The kind of theft that didn't look like theft until you had enough perspective to see all the pieces at once. And most people, including Dominic's own financial team, were only ever looking at one piece at a time. Celeste looked at all of it. She started a spreadsheet on a laptop that had never once connected to any network associated with Dominic Valenti or any of his businesses. She labeled it with a name that meant nothing to anyone but her. And over the following 14 months, she filled it with everything she found. The name Rocco Bellondi meant something specific in Dominic's world. It meant trusted. It meant long-standing. It meant the kind of loyalty you stopped questioning, because it had been tested enough times in enough visible ways that testing it further seemed almost insulting. Rocco had been beside Dominic through 3 organizational crises, 2 federal investigations that went nowhere, and the power transition that established the modern Valenti structure. He was the kind of man you referred to as your right hand without thinking about it, because the phrase has been true for so long that it had stopped being a description and simply become a fact. What Celeste discovered was that Rocco Bellondi had spent the last 6 years treating the Valenti legitimate businesses the way a slow leak treats a water pipe. By the time anyone noticed the damage, the structure was already compromised. The method was elegant. She'd give him that. Inflated contracts with marketing and consulting companies that existed on paper and nowhere else. Management fees paid to subsidiaries that routed back to accounts Rocco controlled through 3 layers of corporate distance. Loans issued by Valenti construction companies to real estate ventures that he held interest in at terms no actual bank would have offered. The losses were real. The explanations for them were false. And the man providing those false explanations, the man whose job it was to make the numbers make sense to Dominic, was Silas Trent, who had apparently decided that loyalty to Rocco was worth more than loyalty to the man who paid him. Celeste couldn't tell whether Silas was complicit or coerced. She suspected complicit based on what she could see of the financial arrangements. But she flagged it as a question she'd need to resolve before she moved. She wasn't going to move until the trap was complete. The decision to approach Dominic as the anonymous financier he so desperately needed was not made quickly or lightly. Celeste spent 3 months considering her options after she had the full picture. Could have gone to Dominic directly. She had thought about it, had actually rehearsed in her own head how that conversation might go. How she would sit across from him with the spreadsheet and the documentation and say, quietly, "You have a problem, and I know who created it, and here is how we fix it." She had imagined his face. The initial denial, which would be automatic. The confusion, because Celeste had never spoken to him this way. The slow dawning understanding. And then what? The problem with going to Dominic directly was not the conversation. Problem was what came after it. Dominic's instinct, when threatened, was force. It was the tool he reached for first, second, and third. If she handed him the evidence against Rocco, he would want to respond. The way he always responded immediately, visibly, in a way that announced his power and punished the insult. And that response, however satisfying it might be in the moment, would destroy half the evidence she'd spent 14 months building and potentially expose Dominic himself to legal liability he currently didn't have. The trap had to spring in the right order. The financial structure had to be isolated first. The evidence had to be secured through channels that could actually be used legally. Rocco and Silas had to be contained, not simply punished, because punishment without containment meant they rebuilt elsewhere and did it again to someone else. Celeste needed Dominic to sign before he understood what he was signing. Not because she wanted to deceive him, though she was clear-eyed about the fact that she was, in fact, deceiving him, and she didn't perform elaborate mental gymnastics to pretend otherwise. But because the outcome she was engineering was the only one that actually worked. She was going to save his empire from the people who were quietly destroying it. She was going to do it in a way that protected the hundreds of innocent employees in his legitimate businesses who had nothing to do with any of this. And she was going to do it on terms that gave her the leverage she needed to walk away from the marriage with something more than a settlement agreement and a signature. She was done being underestimated. She was done being the silent, elegant wife in the emerald dress who stood at the edge of the room and watched. She had watched long enough. The dinner was arranged for a Thursday in November. The restaurant was the kind of place where private dining rooms came with soundproofing as a standard feature, where the staff had been vetted more thoroughly than most law enforcement agencies vetted their own people, and where the maitre d' had a memorized list of clients whose preferences were to be accommodated without discussion or documentation. Dominic used it for meetings he didn't want to appear in anyone's calendar. He had used it 4 times in the past 2 years. The staff knew his face the way they knew a weather pattern reliable, occasionally dangerous, best approached without unnecessary conversation. He had told Celeste he was in Philadelphia. He had told Vivian this meeting was critical, possibly the thing that turned the financial situation around before it became irreversible. He wasn't wrong about that, though the irony of it wouldn't land until later. They arrived at 7:50. Dominic ordered water and the bottle of Barolo he always ordered in this room, because ritual was a form of control, and control was the thing he was always, in every room, trying to maintain. Vivian sat across from him and talked through the presentation they'd prepared for the mysterious A. Are the ask, the projections, the terms they could offer. She was good at this. Her voice was even, professional, carrying just enough confidence to make the numbers sound like opportunity rather than desperation. Dominic checked his watch at 7:58. The private dining room door opened at exactly 8:00. He looked up with the particular expression of a man who is prepared for a meeting, the controlled openness, the slight forward lean that says, "I'm ready to do business," and then everything in his face stopped working the way it was supposed to work. Celeste walked in wearing an emerald evening dress. She was carrying a black leather portfolio. She looked at Dominic with the same calm, interested expression she'd been looking at him with for 12 years, and she pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the chair that had been reserved for A. And she sat down. The room was completely silent. Dominic stood up slowly, without deciding to stand, the way the body moves when the mind hasn't caught up yet. Celeste placed a card on the table and slid it across toward him. He picked it up, Celeste Arden, founder Arden Reserve Holdings. He looked at the initials, AR. The blood left his face so fast that Vivian, who was still sitting across from him, with the presentation folder open in front of her, actually reached toward him before catching herself, because whatever was happening in this room right now, she understood with sudden nauseating clarity that she was not supposed to be in it. Dominic set the card down on the table with the careful precision of a man who is exercising enormous control over his hands. He looked at his wife. Celeste looked back at him. "Sit down, Dominic," she said quietly. "We have a lot to talk about." He sat down. Later, much later, in the particular sleepless honesty that comes at 3 in the morning when there is no one to perform, for he would identify that moment as the one where his understanding of his own life began to change. Not the revelation itself, though that was coming. Not the documents she was about to open, though those would gut him. But the moment he sat down when she told him to. In 42 years of his adult life, Dominic Valenti had never sat down because a woman asked him to. He sat down now without thinking about it, because somewhere beneath the shock and the fury and the confusion that were all rising in him simultaneously, like water filling a room, some part of him, some part that had been paying attention, even when the rest of him hadn't recognized that Celeste Arden was not playing a game. She had already won one, and the question before him now was not whether he could change the outcome. It was whether he was capable of understanding what the outcome actually meant. Celeste opened the portfolio, and Dominic's empire, the one he had spent his life building, the one he thought he understood down to its foundations, began to show him its cracks. Portfolio opened with a sound that seemed too small for what it contained. A soft crack of leather, the quiet rustle of paper, and then Celeste's hands steady, unhurried. The hands of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times that the actual doing of it felt almost like memory began laying documents across the table in a sequence that was clearly deliberate. Not random, not emotional. Deliberate, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before an operation, each one placed where it will be needed, in the order it will be needed, because the person doing the laying out has thought through every step of what comes next. Dominic watched her hands. He could not look at her face yet. He understood this about himself in that moment, with a clarity that surprised him that if he looked at her face right now, something would happen that he wouldn't be able to control, and control was the only thing standing between him and the complete unraveling of everything he thought he knew about the last 12 years of his life. So he watched her hands instead, the thin gold bracelet on her left wrist, the short, clean nails, the absence of any tremor. Vivian had not moved. She was sitting with the presentation folder, still open in front of her, and she had the expression of someone who has just walked into a room and realized, too late, that the room was not what they thought it was. Not guilty, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Awareness. The dawning, sickening awareness of context she hadn't possessed 60 seconds ago and now could not unknow. Celeste. Dominic said her name, like it was a question he didn't know how to finish. "Look at the first page," Celeste said. "I'm not going to just—" "Dominic." Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was the thing about Celeste that his lieutenants, the ones who had occasionally been in rooms with her, sometimes mentioned afterward, with a kind of uneasy respect. She didn't need volume. She had something more effective than volume. She had certainty. "Look at the first page." He looked at the first page. It was a corporate registration document, Arden Reserve Holdings, LLC, filed 9 years ago in Delaware, which was where you filed things when you didn't want them easily found. The registered agent was a law firm he didn't recognize. The listed founder was Celeste M. Arden, her maiden name, not Valenti, which meant that for 9 years this entity had existed in a name that would not appear in any search connected to him. He turned the page. Financial statements. Not summary level. Statements with line items and footnotes, and the kind of granular detail that only means something if you know how to read it. Dominic was not a trained accountant, but he had spent his entire adult life reading financial documents carefully enough to keep himself out of prison, and what these statements described was not a small operation. Arden Reserve Holdings had assets under management that he estimated, scanning the figures, at somewhere between $60 and $80 million. Possibly more, depending on what was marked as contingent. He set the page down. He looked at Vivian, which was a mistake, because looking at Vivian in this particular moment made everything worse in a specific way he hadn't anticipated. She looked back at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and not quite succeeding, and the gap between her trying and her succeeding was its own kind of indictment. He looked back at Celeste. "How long?" he said. It wasn't a complete sentence. He couldn't make it a complete sentence yet. 9 years for the company, Celeste said. The initial capital came from what my mother left me. You never asked what I did with it. He hadn't. He remembered the inheritance, remembered Celeste telling him about it, a number that had seemed significant at the time. He remembered saying something like, "That's yours. Do what you want with it." Because at that point in their marriage, he had been flush enough that the number didn't matter to him, and generous enough, in his way, to mean it. He hadn't asked again. He hadn't followed up. He had filed it in the category of things that were Celeste's domain and moved on. "You turned it into this," he said, gesturing at the documents, a gesture that was more helpless than he intended. "Over time, yes, without telling me. You never asked." The words were not accusatory. That was almost worse. They were simply factual, delivered in a tone that made clear she was not interested in performing anger for his benefit. She had moved past anger, or she had processed it somewhere private and arrived here on the other side of it. And the person sitting across from him now was not the woman in the grip of emotion. She was the woman who had already decided what happened next. Vivian cleared her throat. It was a small sound. Involuntary, probably. But it landed in the silence of the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Dominic watched Celeste's eyes move to her just for a moment, just the briefest shift of attention before returning to him. "She can leave," Celeste said, "or she can stay. That's your choice to make. But what I have to show you doesn't change based on who's in the room." Dominic turned to Vivian. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was smart enough to understand that staying was wrong. She was also human enough to want to stay, because leaving meant walking out into the corridor with no information, and waiting without information was its own specific kind of hell. He watched her make the decision, watched her close the presentation folder. "I'll be outside," she said. Her voice was even. She was good at even. She stood up, smoothed her jacket with one precise motion, and walked to the door without looking at either of them. The door clicked shut behind her. The room felt different without her in it. Smaller somehow. More honest. Dominic leaned back in his chair and looked at his wife, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in a long time, and said, "Tell me what this is." "You know what it is. I want to hear you say it." Celeste folded her hands on top of the portfolio. "Your legitimate businesses are failing. Not because of market conditions and not because of bad luck. Because, for the past 6 years, 2 men inside your organization have been systematically stripping them of capital through a series of fraudulent contracts and redirected payments. By my most conservative estimate, the total amount stolen is somewhere between $14 and $17 million. The actual number is probably higher. I've been documenting it for 18 months. Dominic said nothing. "The man primarily responsible," Celeste continued, "is Rocco Belandi. His mechanism was inflated marketing contracts, paid to companies he controlled through intermediaries. The money moved through 4 different holding entities before it reached him. Silas Trent knew. He adjusted the reporting to hide the losses. He's been doing it long enough that he probably doesn't think of it as a choice anymore." Dominic's jaw was tight. She could see it from across the table, the way the muscle moved just below his ear, the way his hand on the tablecloth had flattened slightly, pressing down. She had seen that pressure before. She knew exactly what it meant. "Rocco's," he said, "just the name." "Yes. You're telling me Rocco has been stealing from me for 6 years?" "Yes." Something happened in Dominic's eyes then that Celeste had prepared herself for, but still found difficult to watch. Not disbelief, he was past disbelief. The documents were too specific, too detailed, too obviously real for disbelief to hold, but something that looked, underneath the fury that was rising over it like floodwater, very much like grief. Because Rocco wasn't just a lieutenant. Rocco was the man who had stood beside him at the worst moments of building this organization, who had driven him to the hospital when the appendicitis hit at 2 in the morning 3 years ago, because Dominic had refused to call an ambulance, and Rocco had been the only one there, who had a standing invitation to Sunday dinner that he used more often than some blood relatives. "Show me," Dominic said. Celeste turned to the next section of documents. She walked him through it methodically. Not quickly. There was no point in rushing through something this complex and expecting genuine comprehension on the other side, but without unnecessary elaboration either. She had organized the material the way a prosecutor organizes a case, chronologically within each category, with the documentary evidence laid alongside the analysis of what it showed. And she had charts. She had account records. She had the corporate registration documents for the shell companies Rocco used, with the dates they were created, mapped against the dates the relevant contracts were signed, showing a pattern that was unmistakable once you were looking for it. Dominic didn't ask many questions. He was absorbing. She had expected this. He was at his most dangerous when he went quiet, when the processing happened internally, and the output was action rather than words. At one point, he picked up a bank record and stared at it for almost 2 minutes without speaking. "This routing number," he finally said, "connects to a company called Meridian Consulting Group," Celeste said, "which has no employees, no office, and no clients other than 3 subsidiaries of Valenti Construction. It was incorporated 18 months before the first payment was made to it, which tells you this wasn't impulsive." Dominic put the record down. "He planned it before I ever gave him the authority to approve these contracts," he said. "Yes." The single syllable sat between them. Then Dominic stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood up and walked to the far side of the room, where there was a narrow window that looked out onto an interior courtyard. And he stood there with his back to her and his hands at his sides and his shoulders, doing something complicated that she understood was the physical containment of a fury that in any other context, would already have become action. She waited. This was what she was good at, waiting without filling the silence, letting it be what it was. "You said you've been documenting this for 18 months, he said, without turning around. "Yes. You knew for 18 months. I suspected for longer. I had enough to be certain approximately 18 months ago." He turned around. "And you didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" It wasn't a question with an inflection. It was a demand, flat and hard, and she met it without flinching. "Because if I'd told you 18 months ago, you would have gone to Rocco that night. You know you would have. And everything I'd built would have been destroyed before it could be used, and Rocco would have eventually walked away from it. He has lawyers. He has his own resources. A confrontation without a contained legal structure around it doesn't punish him, it just warns him." Dominic stared at her. "So you let me keep trusting him," he said slowly. "You watched me put resources into his hands, make decisions based on his counsel, for 18 months while you knew." "Yes." He stopped. Start again. "Do you understand what that cost me?" "Do you understand what it cost me?" Celeste said. The question landed differently than he expected. There was no heat in it. There was something much harder than heat. And for just a moment, a brief, unguarded moment that he would remember much later, in a different kind of silence. Dominic Valenti looked at his wife and saw someone he had not been seeing for a very long time. He sat back down. "There's more," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "There's more." She turned to the next section. What followed was 20 minutes of the most uncomfortable silence Dominic had ever shared with another person, punctuated by Celeste's measured explanations and the occasional sound of a document being placed on the table. She showed him the full scope of the damage, not just the money Rocco had taken, but the downstream effects. The legitimate companies that had been starved of capital and forced to take on debt to cover operational costs. The construction contracts that had been underpriced because the margins were being skimmed before the project started. The real estate developments that had stalled because the financing had been quietly redirected. And then she showed him something he hadn't expected. This company, she said, sliding a document across to him. Vivian approved the marketing contract for it in February of last year. She didn't know who owned it. The contract was presented to her as a routine vendor relationship. But the vendor was one of Rocco's shells. Dominic picked up the document. He looked at it for a long time. She didn't know, Celeste said, and her tone was, he searched for the right word, careful. Not generous. Not vindictive. Careful, like someone handling something sharp. I want to be clear about that. She was used as a mechanism, not a participant. You investigated her, he said. I investigated everything. He set the document down. The weight of what she was telling him, not just about Rocco, but about the fact that she had spent 18 months investigating his entire professional world. Building a picture more complete than anything he himself possessed was beginning to settle on him, the way a structural load settles. Not all at once, incrementally, each new piece adding to the mass until the thing bearing the weight has to adjust or collapse. What do you want? He asked, and this time the question was different. Not hostile, not even defensive. It was the question of a man who has just realized he is at the table of someone more prepared than he is, and who is trying, with whatever dignity he has left, to orient himself. Celeste opened to the last section of the portfolio. I want you to read this, she said, all of it, tonight. She slid the section across to him. It was a restructuring proposal. He could see the shape of it, immediately the way it was organized, the legal language at the front, the financial schedules in the back. He didn't read it in detail. Not yet. He scanned it, the way he scanned documents when he needed the outline before the detail. Arden Reserve will acquire the profitable legitimate assets, Celeste said. We assumed the critical liabilities, the ones that protect the employees and the operational companies. We isolate the corrupt entities, the ones Rocco has been using, and we cut them off from the Valenti structure entirely. You survive financially. The people who work for you keep their jobs. And the trap we've been building around Rocco for 18 months gets to spring the way it was designed to spring. Dominic was quiet. What do you get? He asked. Control of the legitimate businesses. Partnership structure that separates them from the rest of your organization permanently. And my name on the door. She paused. My actual name. He looked up. Arden, she said, not Valenti. The room was very quiet. Dominic put the proposal on the table. He pressed his palm flat against it, not reading it, just touching it, as if he could understand it through contact. Then he looked at her and said, with a directness that surprised even him, You could have let me drown. Yes, she said. The people who have been waiting for me to collapse, you could have just stepped back and let it happen. Yes. Why didn't you? Celeste looked at him for a moment before she answered, and whatever she was doing in that moment, whatever internal accounting she was completing before she spoke it, showed in her face, briefly and honestly, in a way that almost nothing else about this evening had. Because the people who work in those companies didn't do anything wrong, she said. And because what Rocco isn't what you are, and I'm not willing to let his choices define the end of something I spent 12 years living inside. She did not say, and because I loved you, she did not need to. He heard it anyway, in the space between what she said and what she didn't, and it hit him somewhere the documents hadn't reached. He pulled the proposal toward him and began to read. It took him 40 minutes. He didn't speak during those 40 minutes. Neither did she. The wine sat untouched. The food that had been discreetly set on a side table by staff, who had clearly been instructed to be invisible, went equally untouched. Candles burned lower. When he finished, he put the last page down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. My attorney needs to see this, he said. Of course. I want 24 hours. You have 72, she said. I'm not rushing you. I need you to understand what you're signing. He nodded slowly. Then Celeste. The affair, he said. He said it, the way you say a word in a language. You're not sure you're pronouncing correctly, careful, with the awareness that getting it wrong carries consequences. Yes. How long? Almost a year. His face did something complicated that she watched without expression. And you waited, he said. Yes, because of the Rocco situation. Celeste looked at him steadily. Partly, she said. And the single word was the most devastating thing she said all evening, because partly meant there was a reason she hadn't named yet. A reason that had nothing to do with strategy or timing or the careful architecture of an 18-month plan. A reason that was simply human and painful, and his to carry now that she'd handed it to him. Stood up. She gathered the portfolio with the same efficient calm with which she'd opened it. "Read the proposal," she said. "Talk to your attorney. We'll meet again in 72 hours. She picked up her bag. "The room is paid for." She walked to the door. "Celeste." She stopped but didn't turn around immediately. A beat. Then she turned halfway, enough to look at him over her shoulder. Dominic Valenti was sitting at the table of the private dining room, where he'd thought he was going to save his empire, with his wife's documents spread in front of him, and his hands open on the tablecloth, and an expression on his face that she had never once seen there in 12 years of marriage. He looked like a man who was beginning to understand the true dimensions of a room he thought he'd measured long ago. "I didn't know you were this," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even quite a compliment. It was something rarer an admission, and a genuine one, from a man who didn't make them often. Celeste held his gaze for one long moment. "I know," she said. And she walked out. He sat in the room alone for a long time after that. Candles burned down. The food on the side table went cold. Outside the private dining room, in the corridor, Vivian was presumably still waiting, and the thought of facing her, of walking through that door into whatever came next, filled him with a fatigue so profound it felt almost physical. Because there were now two conversations he had to have. Two separate reckonings. The one with his attorney about documents that would restructure everything he'd built. And the one with himself about a woman who had sat beside him at 1,000 dinners and 1,000 events, and in the quiet of 1,000 evenings, and whom he had looked at all that time without seeing. He finally picked up his phone. He called his attorney, Marcus Webb, who answered on the second ring the way he always did, because men in Marcus Webb's position understood that second ring availability was part of what they were paid for. "I need you to clear your morning," Dominic said. A pause. "How early?" "All of it. I'll be at your office at 8. Another pause, longer. Marcus Webb was a man who had seen a great deal of Dominic Valenti's professional life, and he was good enough at his job to understand from those 6 words, "I need you to clear your morning," that whatever was coming was not routine. "I'll be there," he said. Dominic hung up. Then he sat there for another 10 minutes, doing something he almost never did. Nothing. Just sitting in the wreckage of the evening, not strategizing, not planning, not converting the information into action the way his mind usually did automatically. Just sitting with the weight of it. He thought about Rocco. He thought about Silas. He thought about Celeste, 9 years ago. Opening a company in her maiden name, with money he'd told her, was hers, in a city where his name was heavy enough to move mountains, and moving quietly in the opposite direction. He thought about the blue wildflowers she'd planted, along the garden wall, the spring before last. How she'd told him they took years to bloom, and he'd nodded, without really hearing her, because he was on the phone, and the phone call was about something that seemed, at the time, more important. He finally stood up. He buttoned his jacket with mechanical precision. He straightened his cuffs. He looked, to anyone who might have seen him walking throughout the restaurant toward the exit, like a man who had simply finished a business dinner and was ready to go home. He found Vivian in the corridor, standing with her coat already on, and her bag over her shoulder, which told him she had made some assessment of her own about how this evening was ending, and had begun preparing for it. She looked at him when he came through the door, and her face asked 100 questions without forming a single one of them out loud, because she understood, on some instinctive level, the available answers tonight were going to be limited and partial, and that pressing for more than that would only make everything worse. "We need to talk," he said. "I know. Not tonight." She absorbed this. "Okay." He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, the way he'd just really looked at Celeste, with the particular clarity that follows a shock, large enough to strip away the comfortable blurring that ordinary perception depends on, and he saw what he saw to let himself see clearly in a long time. Not a strategist, not a pressure valve, not a version of simplicity he'd convinced himself he needed. Person. A person who had made choices that made sense from inside her own life, and who was now standing in a corridor, paying the price of information she hadn't had when she made them. He didn't say any of that. "I'll call you," he said. He walked past her toward the exit. The cold air outside hit him like a correction. His car was waiting. His driver, Paolo, had been with him for 11 years, and had the particular gift of the long-serving driver, which was the ability to read the state of the person getting into the car and adjust accordingly. He took one look at Dominic getting into the back seat and said nothing. Not a word. Just started the car and pulled into traffic with the smooth precision of a man who understood that silence was the only thing on offer tonight. They drove for 7 minutes before Dominic spoke. "Take me home," he said. Not to Vivian's building on the Upper East Side, where he'd been going on Thursday nights for the past 8 months. Home. The actual home. The house in Westchester with the garden behind it and the blue wildflowers growing along the stone wall, and 12 years of a life he had been failing in ways he was only beginning to count, to understand. Paolo made no adjustment to his route. He had already been headed there. Dominic looked out the window at the city lights moving past and thought about what it meant that his driver had assumed he was going home before he said so. He thought about what else the people closest to him had been assuming, correctly, about directions he hadn't announced. He thought about Celeste opening that portfolio with her steady hands. And somewhere on the Triborough Bridge, with the water black and wide below, and the city lights smearing in the wet window glass, Dominic Valenti arrived at the understanding that had been building since 8 o'clock, the understanding that he had been living for years inside a version of his own life that was less accurate than the version the woman across that table had been living inside. She had known his empire better than he did. She had known his organization better than he did. She had known for almost a year the thing he'd worked hardest to keep from her. And she had taken all of that knowledge and built something with it, not destruction, not revenge, but a structure, a plan, something that, when he'd finally read it in its entirety, had struck him not with the anger he'd expected to feel, but with a grudging, unwilling, deeply uncomfortable recognition. It was a good plan. It was, in fact, the best available plan. And the person who had built it was the person he had spent 12 years looking at without seeing. Car came off the bridge and moved through the quiet streets north of the city, and Dominic pressed his fingers against the cold glass of the window and thought about the conversation he was going to have with Marcus Webb in the morning, and the one he was going to have with himself sometime after that, and the one he was, eventually, inevitably, going to have with Rocco Bellondi. That last one would not be in a lawyer's office. He arrived home at 11:40. The house was lit in the way it was always lit. When Celeste was out, a lamp in the front room, a light in the upstairs hallway the kitchen left on. He had never thought about those lights before, had always simply arrived home to find them, and moved through the house without registering them as choices someone had made for him. Someone who thought about what he'd need when he came home in the dark. He stood in the front hallway for a long time. Then he went to his study. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon and didn't drink them. He set the glass on the desk and sat down and opened Marcus's number again on his phone and then closed it, because there was nothing more to say before morning. He opened the desk drawer. Inside, under a folder of unrelated documents, was a photograph from their 5th anniversary, a dinner somewhere in the south of France that Celeste had planned, and he had almost canceled because of a business complication that he could no longer. Sitting here now, even remember. She was laughing in the photograph, genuinely laughing, tilted toward him with the ease of a woman in the company of someone she trusted. He had trusted himself with her. He was no longer certain that trust had been warranted. He put the photograph back. He closed the drawer. He drank the bourbon in one slow, deliberate movement, and then sat in the silence of his study with the empty glass in his hand and the full weight of tomorrow already beginning to gather in the room around him. Marcus would read the documents and confirm what Dominic already, in his gut, knew they would confirm. And then there would be no more time to sit with the weight of this alone. Then it would be time to decide what kind of man he was going to be, when there was no more room to be anything other than exactly that. He set the glass down. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the garden. And along the stone wall, in the dark, the blue wild indigo held its ground and waited, the way it always did, for the slow turning of a season it had learned to outlast. Marcus Webb's office smelled like old paper and expensive coffee, and the particular kind of discretion that costs more per hour than most people make in a week. It was 8:14 in the morning when Dominic arrived, which meant he was 14 minutes late, which meant he had slept badly and dressed quickly, and sat in the car on the way over doing the thing he almost never did, second-guessing. Not the meeting, not the decision to come, but the entire preceding architecture of assumptions that had brought him to a point where this meeting was necessary. Marcus was already at his desk when the assistant showed Dominic in. He was a compact man in his late 60s with silver hair cut close, and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, and the slightly compressed expression of someone who has been awake since 6, which he had been, because Dominic had texted him at 6:15 with a 3-word message, "Bring your coffee." Marcus knew what that meant. It meant the documents were serious. It meant Dominic had read them already and needed someone else to confirm what he'd read. It meant that whatever was coming through the door at 8 o'clock was going to require the particular brand of careful, unhurried attention that Marcus Webb had spent 40 years cultivating for exactly these moments. Dominic put the portfolio on the desk. Marcus looked at it, then at Dominic. Then he picked up the portfolio, opened it, pushed his reading glasses down onto his nose, and began to read. He read for 51 minutes. Dominic knew because he watched the clock on Marcus's wall, an old thing, analog, kind that makes a faint mechanical sound on each second, and counted the minutes the way you count things when your mind needs something to do that isn't thinking about what it's actually thinking about. When Marcus finished, he took his glasses off and set them on the desk and looked at Dominic with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping not to confirm. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "My wife." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Celeste put this together." "Yes, over 18 months. That's what she told me." Marcus picked up one of the pages and held it at arm's length, as if distance might change what it said. "The corporate structure on the Meridian contracts alone, Dominic. I need you to understand that whoever built this documentation built it specifically to be legally usable. This isn't a wife who found something and wrote it down. This is a structured evidentiary package. Someone with real expertise in financial forensics helped put this together." "She has resources," Dominic said. "I didn't know how many." "Apparently not." Marcus set the page down. He was quiet again, in the way he got quiet when he was working through something with real care. "The restructuring proposal is sound. More than sound. It's the best available option, given the exposure you're sitting on. If these losses are as deep as you were looking at insolvency on the legitimate side within 18 months regardless. What she's proposing actually saves the operational core. I know, which means she's not trying to destroy you. I know that too." Marcus folded his hands on the desk. "Then what's the problem?" Dominic looked at him. "She's also divorcing me." Marcus absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things Dominic valued most about him. He didn't perform surprise. He didn't perform sympathy. He simply received information and adjusted. "Has she filed?" "Not yet. She put the papers in the portfolio. She wants the restructuring signed first." "Smart," Marcus said. Then, reading Dominic's expression, "I'm not editorializing. I'm noting that the sequencing protects both of you. If she files before the restructuring is signed, it complicates the asset transfer. She's keeping it clean. She keeps everything clean," Dominic said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, not bitterness, exactly, but the close relative of it, the feeling of a man who has just discovered that someone he thought he understood has been operating on a different level the entire time. Marcus opened the proposal to the signature pages. "I need 2 days to review the subsidiary structures and confirm the liability schedules. If the numbers match what she's documented, and I expect they will, because this is not the work of someone who makes careless errors, then my professional recommendation is that you sign it. I already know I'm going to sign it. Then why are you here? Dominic was quiet for a moment. Because I need someone to tell me I'm not missing something. Some angle I haven't seen. Some reason this isn't what it looks like. Marcus looked at him steadily. What does it look like? It looks like my wife spent 9 years building something I had no idea existed, spent 18 months documenting a theft I never caught, and then walked into a room I thought I controlled and handed me the only workable solution to a problem I didn't know was this bad. He paused. And it looks like she did all of that while I was busy not paying attention to her. That's what it looks like, Marcus said, because that's what it is. The directness of it landed without softening, the way Marcus intended it to. He had known Dominic Valenti for 19 years, and he understood that what this man needed right now was not comfort. It was contact with something true. Dominic nodded once. Rocco, he said, that's the part that needs careful handling. I'm aware, Dominic. Marcus leaned forward slightly. I need to say this clearly. The evidence she's compiled, if you act on it, the way your instincts are telling you to act on it, you potentially compromise the legal case and expose yourself to liability for the response. Path she's laid out, isolating the entities and routing the evidence through her attorneys into the appropriate channels, that's the path that actually finishes him. The other path just hurts him and leaves him dangerous. Dominic looked at the wall for a moment. She said the same thing. She's right. She's right about a lot of things. Dominic said, and this time the thing in his voice was something closer to recognition than bitterness. And Marcus Webb, who was not a sentimental man, felt the particular weight of it and decided not to say anything further on that topic. 2 days, Marcus said. I'll have a full review ready. Dominic stood. He picked up the portfolio with the care of someone handling something that has already, irrevocably, changed the shape of things. One more thing, Marcus said. Dominic paused. The affair. Is it over? Dominic looked at him. What does that matter to the legal situation? It doesn't, Marcus said. I'm asking because I've known you for 19 years, and I'm asking. A long pause it will be, Dominic said. He left. The drive back took longer than it should have because there was an accident on the expressway, and Paolo had to take surface streets, which meant 40 minutes of stop-and-go through mid-morning traffic that Dominic spent looking out the window at the city, moving past him at walking pace. He was thinking about Rocco. Specifically, he was thinking about a Sunday dinner 3 winters ago when Rocco had sat at Dominic's table and eaten Celeste's cooking and laughed at Dominic's joke about the construction permits and gone home that night to whatever account he was building the walls of his betrayal in, one redirected payment at a time. He was thinking about what that meant about trust. Not Rocco's betrayal specifically. He had, in his professional life, survived betrayals before and would survive them again. He was thinking about the mechanism of it, the way trust, once given, becomes a kind of blindness. The way a man can look at something every day and not see it because he has already decided what it is. He had decided what Celeste was. He had been wrong. He had decided what Rocco was. He had been catastrophically wrong. Question he couldn't shake, sitting in the back of a car in mid-morning traffic with the portfolio on the seat beside him, was how many other things he had decided without looking carefully enough. Called Rocco at 11:20. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Sunday dinner, Dominic said. Usual time, the estate. Done, Rocco said, with the ease of a man who has been getting this invitation for years and has no reason to suspect this one is different. You want me to bring anything? Just yourself, Dominic said. He hung up. His hand, he noticed, was completely steady. That scared him a little. Not the steadiness itself, but what it said about how far down the part of himself that handled this kind of thing was buried that he could make that call. Hearing Rocco's voice carrying its familiar warmth and feel nothing except a cold and functional clarity. He wondered when that had happened, when the ability to perform normalcy while feeling nothing had stopped being a survival skill and started being something closer to a default state. He thought about Celeste asking him, across that table, do you understand what it cost me? and the way she'd said it, without any performance at all, just the plain fact of it, offered without expectation of anything in return. He thought maybe it had been happening for a long time. He thought maybe that was something worth being troubled by. He arrived back at the estate at 12:40. He ate lunch alone, something Maria, the housekeeper, had left covered on the kitchen counter with a handwritten note that said, "There is also soup." He ate the soup. He hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, and his body registered it. That basic animal accounting that continues regardless of what the mind is doing. After lunch, he went to his study and made 3 calls each to a senior captain, each framed as routine, each designed to establish where things stood without revealing that he was establishing where things stood. He was checking without checking, taking a temperature without producing a thermometer. What he found in the careful spaces between what people said and what they didn't was that the concern he'd been managing about the legitimate businesses was more widely known among his captains than he'd understood. Not the cause they didn't know about Rocco yet, or at least hadn't connected the full picture, but the effect. The conversations Dominic had been accepting Silas's reassurances about. The questions that had been brought to Rocco and answered in ways that were later, Dominic now realized, designed to redirect attention rather than provide information. He had been managed. In his own organization, by men who worked for him, he had been managed. That recognition settled into him during the 3rd call and stayed there, cold and specific, like a stone dropped into still water that doesn't float back up. He finished the calls and sat in his study as the afternoon light shifted across the floor and thought about Sunday. Sunday was 3 days away. He could do what Celeste had asked, sign the restructuring, contain the financial situation, let the legal mechanism do what it was built to do. Trust a process he hadn't designed, administered by a woman whose judgment had, in the past 24 hours, proven more reliable than his own. Or he could do what every instinct he had spent 20 years developing was telling him to do. He sat with that tension for the rest of the afternoon. He did not resolve it. What happened on Friday morning made the question partially irrelevant. He was at his desk at 7:15, earlier than usual, working through the financial documentation Celeste had given him with fresh eyes and a legal pad, where he was noting specific questions for Marcus when his phone rang. It was Danny Reese, one of his junior captains, not a man. Dominic would normally take a call from at this hour, but Danny had a specific designation in Dominic's contact list that meant answer immediately, regardless of time. Because Danny had an unusual ability to be physically present in places where things happened before they were supposed to happen, and that ability had been worth a great deal over the years. "Tell me," Dominic said. Danny's voice was tight in the way voices get. Someone is trying to deliver information without letting the information infect their own affect. "Rocco had a meeting last night. Private. Castellan Hotel, one of the back rooms. 3 people, I made 2 of them. Silas Trent and a man named Porter, who is a litigation attorney I have seen before, in connection with a financial restructuring case 2 years ago." Dominic said nothing. "They met for 2 hours, Danny said. I don't have audio. I have photographs of the 3 of them entering and leaving within the same window. I have a source inside the hotel who confirmed the room was booked under a name that connects after 2 steps to one of the same shell company structures that," Danny paused, "that your wife's documents describe." The last 4 words came out carefully, which told Dominic that Danny knew more about what Celeste had delivered Thursday night than Dominic had disclosed to anyone, which told him something about how information moved in his own house. "How do you know what my wife's documents describe?" Dominic asked. Pause that lasted exactly long enough to be honest. "Because people talk, and because some of what's in those documents isn't news to everyone." Dominic was quiet for 5 full seconds. "You knew." "I suspected," Danny said. "I didn't have the full picture. I didn't have anything I could bring you," without he stopped. "Without being the person who brought it. And Rocco has been in your ear for a long time, and I have not." It was the most honest thing anyone in Dominic's organization had said to him in years. It was also, in its own way, an indictment of the environment Dominic had created, one where even the people with good instincts and legitimate concerns had calculated that the cost of speaking was too high. What was the attorney there for? Dominic asked. My read? Rocco is building a defensive structure. He knows something is moving. He doesn't know what or from which direction, but he's setting up legal cover, which means he's preparing to be confronted and he has a story ready for it. Dominic absorbed this. Or he's preparing something offensive. That's the other possibility, Danny said. Yes. Dominic thought about Celeste's warning. Destroying everyone tonight would only destroy the evidence with them. He thought about the 18-month structure she'd built. The careful, legally usable documentation. The wall she'd spent a year and a half constructing around Rocco Belandi before she ever let the gate open. And he thought about Rocco sitting across from a litigation attorney on a Thursday night, which meant Rocco was now building walls of his own. I need to know everything he does between now and Sunday, Dominic said. Not summaries, everything. Understood. He hung up. He sat motionless at his desk for 30 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Celeste. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was composed, she had slept. He could tell, in a way that he had not, and she said simply, Dominic. Rocco met with a litigation attorney last night, he said. Private meeting. He's building cover. A brief silence. How brief was your call to him yesterday? Short. Routine. Sunday dinner. Did you say anything that would have indicated you know? No. Are you sure? He thought about it, honestly, which he was finding easier to do this morning than he normally found it. I'm sure. Then the attorney isn't a reaction to you, she said. He's been moving toward this independently. He's been anticipating exposure for some time. A pause. Which means he's further along than I thought. How does that change your timeline? It accelerates it. Her voice was still level, but he could hear, underneath it, the particular sound of a mind adjusting quickly. I need to make a call this morning. The accounts I've been monitoring, I need to check whether there's been movement in the last 48 hours. What kind of movement? The kind that happens when someone decides the window is closing and wants to consolidate what they've taken before it becomes impossible to move. A pause. Give me 2 hours. She hung up. Dominic put the phone down and stared at the legal pad in front of him. Then he stood up and walked to the window that looked out onto the back of the estate toward the garden. From here through the glass, he could see the stone wall along the far edge, the one where the wild indigo grew. The garden was bare this time of year, everything dormant. The wall was just stone and dried stems, and the suggestion of structure that would mean something again in spring, if you knew how to look at it. He was beginning to understand how to look at it. He waited. An hour and 40 minutes later, Celeste called back. He moved money, she said, and her voice was different now, not unsteady. Celeste Arden did not do unsteady, but compressed in a way that told him what he needed to know about what she'd found. 3 transfers in the last 36 hours. One of the Meridian Shell accounts was liquidated. The funds moved through 2 intermediaries before landing in an offshore account that I haven't seen in any of the documents I've been tracking. New account, which means he's been holding it in reserve, which means he planned for the possibility of needing to run. Dominic turned from the window. How much? From that account alone? Around 4 million. That's just what I can see. If there are other accounts I haven't traced. There are other accounts you haven't traced, Dominic said. Yes, she said, there are. A silence between them that was heavy, with the specific weight of a plan beginning to come apart at its edges. The Sunday meeting, Dominic said. If he comes. If he thinks he's still safe. He might not come, Celeste said. If he's moving money, he's calculating risk. Question is whether he thinks you know. If he believes the dinner is routine, he'll come because not coming would signal something. But if he suspects, he'll be gone before Sunday. Yes. Dominic pressed his fingers against the windowsill. Then we need to move faster, Dominic. Her voice was careful. Precise. The legal structure I've built requires the restructuring to be signed and filed before Rocco is confronted. If you move against him before that's done, the asset protection dissolves and the legitimate businesses are exposed. And if he runs before Sunday, the evidence you've built becomes harder to enforce. Yes, so we have a window, a narrow one. How narrow? Pause. Marcus needs to finish his review. I'll call Marcus now. He can have his review done today, if I tell him it's urgent. Dominic Celeste. He said her name and then stopped. And in the stop was something that hadn't been there in their conversations for a very long time. Something that was almost recognizably the two of them working in the same direction. Can you trust me on the timing? I'll get the documents reviewed and I'll sign today. But you need to move the legal filing up. Whatever your attorneys need to do to be ready. I'll call them this morning. A beat. You'll sign today. I'll sign today another beat. Longer. All right, she said. He called Marcus immediately after and told him he needed the review completed by 4 o'clock. Marcus said that was not how legal review worked. Dominic said he understood and he needed it completed by 4 o'clock. Marcus was quiet for a moment and then said he would call with whatever he had by 4. Then Dominic did something he had not done in a very long time. He called a meeting of his senior captains for Saturday morning. Not Sunday, Saturday, which meant 24 hours earlier than Rocco was expecting anything. He framed it, on the calls, as a routine, a financial update, something they did occasionally, nothing extraordinary. He used the same tone he'd used calling Rocco on Thursday. Even, familiar, the tone of a man who is not holding something behind his back. He was holding something behind his back. Several things, in fact. By 3:15, Marcus called with his review. His voice had the compressed quality of a man who has spent 6 hours reading something he wished he hadn't had to read, not because it was false, but because it was true. The liability schedules are accurate. The asset valuations are conservative, if anything. Corporate structure she's proposing is clean and legally defensible. A pause. Sign it, I'm signing it. At 5 o'clock, Dominic said. At her attorney's office. She'll be there. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You want me there? Yes. Then I'll be there. He arrived at the attorney's office at 4:50. It was a firm he didn't know, not a firm that operated in his usual orbit, which was itself a statement about how carefully Celeste had built this. She had not used anyone he could have anticipated or accessed. The office was in Midtown, on a floor that housed several other law firms, with a reception area that was tastefully plain and a conference room that smelled like new carpet and good ventilation. Celeste was already there. She was sitting at the conference table in a dark jacket with a cup of tea in front of her and two of her attorneys, one of whom Dominic recognized as a highly regarded financial litigator whose name he had seen in connection with two significant cases in the past decade, which told him something new about the scale of resources she had brought to bear on this. Marcus arrived 2 minutes after Dominic. They sat across from each other, Dominic and Marcus on one side, Celeste and her attorneys on the other, and for a moment nobody spoke, and the room held the particular charge of a meeting, where everyone present understands that what happens in the next hour will be functionally irreversible. Celeste looked at him across the table. He looked at her. He thought about saying something. Several things formed and dissolved in the space of about 4 seconds. He thought about the restaurant Thursday night, the portfolio opening, cards sliding across the table, the way she'd told him to sit down and he'd sat down. He picked up the pen. He signed the restructuring agreement on the marked pages, 11 of them, each requiring his signature and initials, each representing a transfer of something he had spent his life building to a structure that would now operate under Celeste's authority. Marcus witnessed each one. Celeste's lead attorney notarized. When he put the pen down after the 11th page, something shifted in the room that wasn't quite audible, but was nonetheless real, the specific atmospheric change that follows an action that cannot be undone. Celeste's attorney gathered the documents. We file this afternoon, she said to Dominic. Confirmation by end of business. Dominic nodded. Celeste was looking at the table, at the space where the documents had been. Then she looked up. The captain's meeting is tomorrow? She asked. He had not told her about the captain's meeting. He looked at her. Yes. Are you ready for it? It was a genuine question. He understood that. Not rhetorical. Not pointed. She was asking whether he had what he needed to walk into a room with the men who had been working alongside a traitor and do what needed to be done without unraveling the rest of what they'd built. He thought about what ready meant in this context. I'll need the evidence packet you described, he said. The recorded communications, the bank records, the ownership structures. My attorney will have them at the estate by 9 tomorrow morning. He nodded again. Then he stood. Marcus stood with him. Dominic buttoned his jacket and looked across the table at his wife, who was sitting with her hands folded in front of her, the way she'd sat at the restaurant table, with that quality she had of being fully present in a room without performing it. "Celeste," he said. She waited. He wanted to say something commensurate to the moment. Something that carried the weight of what had happened in the last 48 hours. Of what he now understood that he hadn't understood before. Of the specific and irreversible cost of the distance between those two positions. What he said was, "Thank you." It was the smallest possible version of what he meant. He knew that. She knew that. But it was also, unlike many of the things he had said in the preceding 12 years, completely true. She looked at him for a moment. "Don't waste it," she said. He left. In the elevator going down, Marcus stood beside him and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. The lobby was busy with end-of-day foot traffic people, moving in the efficient, purposeful way of a city at 5:15 on a Friday, and Dominic moved through it without being jostled, which was the product of something in the way he carried himself that people responded to without necessarily knowing why. Outside, the late afternoon was cold and gray, and the kind of overcast that feels like pressure. Paolo was at the curb. Dominic got in. He sat in the back of the car as it pulled into traffic, and he thought about Saturday morning. The estate. His captains arranged around the table where he had held 100 meetings about 100 different problems, each of which had felt, at the time, like the most pressing thing in front of him. He thought about Rocco arriving in that room, believing himself safe. He thought about Celeste's evidence packet landing on that table. He thought about what it meant to do this the right way, not the way his instincts demanded, not the way his history said it was done, but the way Celeste had spent 18 months carefully, patiently, exhaustingly constructing, and he thought about whether he was capable of it. Not the confrontation. He'd been capable of confrontation his entire adult life. The restraint, the sequenced, deliberate, legally constructed restraint that left no room for Rocco to rebuild, and no exposure for Dominic, and no collateral damage for the people who hadn't done anything wrong. That was the thing he wasn't sure about. That was the thing he was going to have to find out. Car moved through Friday traffic, and somewhere across the city, Celeste Arden's attorneys were filing documents that would permanently alter the structure of everything Dominic Valenti had built. And somewhere else in that same city, Rocco Belandi was moving money through accounts, thought he were hidden, and meeting with attorneys he thought would protect him, and calculating a future in which he had successfully extracted himself from the organization he had been quietly hollowing out for 6 years. He had miscalculated one thing. He had miscalculated Celeste. And now, sitting in the back of a car on a Friday afternoon, watching the city slide past in the gray late light, Dominic Valenti was beginning to understand what it actually meant to be on the same side as someone who did not miscalculate. It felt different than he'd expected. It felt in a way he didn't have a word for yet, and wasn't sure he deserved to claim, something close to the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has just, for the first time, set it down. Tomorrow would tell him whether he was equal to what she'd built. He pressed his palm flat against the cold window glass. Saturday was coming, and Rocco Belandi was coming with it. Saturday arrived the way bad days often do quietly, with ordinary light. The estate at 7:40 in the morning looked like it always looked on a weekend, the gravel drive raked clean, the fountain in the front courtyard switched off for the season, the house sitting in the gray November stillness with the particular solidity of a building that has absorbed a great many difficult hours and expects to absorb more. Maria had been told to set up the dining room for a business meeting. Coffee, water, nothing elaborate. She had done it without asking questions because Maria had worked in this house for 9 years and understood that the questions worth asking were not the ones that presented themselves most obviously. Dominic was up at 5:30. He had slept 4 hours, which was more than he expected and less than he needed, and he woke with the specific clarity that sometimes follows insufficient sleep the mind stripped of its usual cushioning, operating on something closer to the bone. He showered. He dressed in the dark suit he wore for serious meetings, the one with the slight weight in the fabric that made him stand differently in it, the way a well-made tool sits differently in the hand than a cheap one. He ate half a piece of toast and drank 2 cups of coffee standing at the kitchen counter while the house was still quiet around him. At 8:50, a car arrived from Celeste's attorney's office. A young associate mid-20s, serious face, the careful energy of someone who has been given strict instructions and intends to follow them, exactly brought in a sealed envelope and a hard-sided case that contained, Dominic understood, the documentary evidence that Celeste had spent 18 months assembling. The associate asked Dominic to sign a receipt. Dominic signed it. The associate left without making small talk, which Dominic appreciated. He opened the envelope at his desk. Inside was a single handwritten note, Celeste's handwriting, which he recognized, the clean, upright script she'd had since long before he met her. It said, "The order matters. Bank records first, then the communications, then the ownership structures. Let the evidence speak before you do." He read it twice. Then he put it in his breast pocket. At 9:30, the first captain arrived. By 10 o'clock, 7 of his 9 senior captains were seated around the dining room table. The 8th called to say he was 20 minutes out. The 9th, an older man named Caruso, who had been with the organization longer than almost anyone and who moved slowly due to a hip he refused to have replaced, arrived at 10:04, walking with his cane, and sat down at the far end of the table. Particular expression of a man who has attended enough of these meetings to know when one is different from the ones it's pretending to be. Rocco arrived at 10:12. Came in the way he always came in, with the ease of a man who considers himself at home in any room he walks into. Hanging his coat on the hook near the door, the way he always did, accepting coffee from Maria the way he always did, greeting the other captains with the particular mixture of warmth and authority that had made him effective in his role for years. He was good at this. Dominic had always known he was good at this. The room responded to him the way rooms respond to someone they're accustomed to treating as safe. He sat down across from Dominic. He looked at Dominic the way he'd looked at him, at 100 meetings direct, settled, the eyes of a man with nothing to hide, which was itself a performance so practiced it had probably stopped feeling like one. "You look like you haven't slept," Rocco said. "I haven't slept much," Dominic said. Something specific, or just the general misery of the situation? Something specific. Rocco nodded, as if this was a satisfactory answer, and picked up his coffee. Dominic waited until everyone was settled, until the coffee cups were in hand and the ambient noise of 8 men arranging themselves in a room had subsided, and the particular quiet of a meeting waiting to begin had taken hold. Then he opened the hard-sided case. He placed the first document set on the table. "These are bank records," he said. "I need everyone to look at them. Take your time." He distributed copies, one to each man at the table, printed and organized the way Celeste's documentation was organized, which was with the clarity of someone who understood that the person reading it might be encountering this information for the first time and needed to be led through it without ambiguity. The room was quiet while people read. Dominic watched faces. He watched Silas Trent, who was sitting 2 seats to his left, pick up the documents with the practiced neutrality of a man who has been controlling his expression in difficult situations for a long time, and then, in the span of about 4 seconds, read down the first page, lose that neutrality in a way that was small but visible. A slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible change in the set of his mouth. The look of a man who has just seen, on paper, the specific shape of something he hoped he'd buried deeply enough. Silas did not look up from the page. Rocco read with deliberate calm. His eyes moved steadily across the text. His coffee cup sat in his hand without trembling. When he reached the bottom of the first page, he turned to the second with the unhurried movement of a man reading something that doesn't concern him. But Dominic had been watching people manage their own faces his entire adult life, and he saw it, the thing that Rocco had almost suppressed completely. It was in his left hand, which had returned the coffee cup to the table, and then rested there, the fingers not quite still. Not shaking, just not quite still, in the way hands are when the rest of the body is holding something the muscles want to release. Old Caruso, at the far end of the table, looked up after 2 pages and looked at Dominic. Dominic met his eyes. Something passed between them that required no words. Caruso looked back down at the documents. "What are we looking at?" one of the younger captains asked. Bertelli, good instincts, not enough experience to have learned yet, when not to ask the first question. "You're looking at $17 million, Dominic said. "That went somewhere it wasn't supposed to go." The room shifted. "Where?" Bertelli asked. "Keep reading," Dominic said. "It's in the second section." He placed the second document set on the table. The communications, the recorded exchanges that Celeste's investigators had obtained through means he hadn't inquired about and didn't intend to, because some information is better held at a certain distance. Phone records, first, then transcripts of electronic communications. Then, and this was the piece that had hit him hardest when he reviewed it the night before, a series of messages between Rocco and Silas in which they discussed, with the casual efficiency of men who consider themselves untouchable, exactly how the financial structure would be unwound if the situation changed. The situation, Dominic. They had discussed what to do when Dominic fell, using the word when rather than if, in messages sent from devices connected to Valenti company networks, which meant somewhere in the chain of their confidence, they had stopped believing they needed to be careful. The room was not quiet now. There was the particular noise of men reading something that disturbs them, the shifted weight, the exhaled breath, the involuntary sound that escapes before professional composure reasserts itself. Bertelli made a sound that was halfway between a word and not. Caruso at the far end had stopped reading and was looking at Rocco with the fixed, unreadable attention of a man who has lived long enough to have seen betrayal before and recognizes it on contact. Rocco put his documents down. He looked at Dominic. "Where did this come from?" He said. His voice was level. Controlled, the voice of a man who has decided in the 3 minutes he's had to calculate that his best available position is challenge rather than retreat. "Does it matter?" Dominic said. "It matters if it's fabricated." "It's not fabricated. You have transcripts of my private communications." "I'd like to know how." "Rocco." Dominic said his name the way you say the name of someone you're done performing for. Flat, direct, without the warmth that had lived in it for years. "There are 8 other people in this room. You're welcome to tell them this is fabricated. But they can read." Rocco looked at the men around the table. He did it quickly, scanning for something, for doubt, for the specific openness of men who haven't made up their minds yet, for the gap in the consensus where a person skilled at working rooms might still find purchase. He didn't find it. What he found were 8 men who had been in this organization long enough to understand what they were looking at, most of whom were looking back at him with expressions that had closed, in the way expressions close when the question has been settled. All except Silas, who was looking at the table. "Silas," Rocco said. Silas did not look up. Silas, harder this time. "Don't," Silas said quietly, to the surface of the table. Rocco turned back to Dominic. Something had changed in his face. The control was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over something that was beginning to show through it. Not fear, exactly. Because Rocco was not a man who frightened easily, but a recalibration. The urgent internal adjustment of someone who has just discovered that the room they believe they were in is not the room they're actually in. "You've been listening to your wife," Rocco said. Dominic said nothing. "She's been in your ear for years. You know that. She's been trying to... Stop. I'm telling you, whatever she gave you, whatever she..." I said stop. Dominic's voice had not risen. It had done the opposite, dropped, in the way it dropped when he was most serious, going quiet and specific the way a precision instrument goes quiet before it does what it was made to do. "The documents speak for themselves. I've had them reviewed by my attorney. I've verified the bank records independently. What I'm going to do now is ask you one question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer it." Rocco was very still. "The account at Meridian," Dominic said. "The one that was liquidated in the last 48 hours. Where did the $4 million go?" The room registered this, the knowing of it, the specific knowing that meant Dominic had been watching even the moves Rocco had made in the last 2 days. Bertelli's head came up. Caruso's expression did something subtle. Even the men who hadn't spoken since sitting down shifted almost imperceptibly, the way people shift when the stakes in a room suddenly clarify. Rocco looked at Dominic for a long moment, and then he said, "I want a lawyer." The words landed in the room and did not bounce. Caruso made a sound. Low, short, the sound of a man who has sat in difficult rooms for 40 years and just heard the thing that ends the discussion. "That's not how this works," Bertelli said, before anyone else could speak, and the speed of it surprised the room, because Bertelli was young enough that most of the older men tended to expect him to wait. "Yo." "He's right," Dominic said. "This isn't a courtroom. This is your organization telling you what it knows." He looked at Rocco without heat, without performance, with the steady directness that Celeste had modeled for him across a restaurant table 3 days ago, and that he was, consciously, drawing on now. "You stole from me. You stole from this organization. You used the money we built together to prepare for the moment when I failed so that you could take what was left. And you did it for 6 years while sitting at my table." The last 3 words came out differently than the rest. Quieter, personal in a way the financial evidence wasn't. Rocco's jaw moved. "I did what I needed to do to protect myself," he said. "Because you stopped being someone who could be trusted to keep this thing standing. The legitimate businesses were going to take you down, and everyone around you with them. I was building a contingency for yourself," Caruso said from the far end of the table, and the room fell silent again because Caruso almost never spoke in meetings, and when he did, people listened. "For everyone," Rocco started. "The accounts are in your name," Caruso said. "Not anyone else's yours." He tapped the document in front of him. "Page 7. The ownership structure, your name. Don't insult this room." Rocco stopped talking. He sat back in his chair. He looked at Dominic with the expression of a man who has run out of angles and is now deciding something different, not whether he can win the argument, but something else. Something that lived in a harder part of him. "So what happens now?" he said. "Now," Dominic said, "you listen." He reached into the case and placed the final document set on the table. These were the legal filings, the corporate restructuring documents, already filed, already confirmed, already functionally in effect as of Friday afternoon. The isolation of the corrupt entities, the transfer of the legitimate businesses to the new holding structure, the evidence package routed through Celeste's attorneys to the appropriate legal channels. "The companies you were using are cut off from the Valenti structure, as of yesterday," Dominic said. "The financial records have been provided to a law firm operating independently of both of us. You're not going to be able to reach your attorneys fast enough to stop what's already moving." Rocco looked at the documents. For the first time since sitting down, he looked at them the way a man looks at something, when he understands it is real. "The 4 million, Dominic said again. "I'm asking because it changes what the next conversation looks like, not because it changes what already happened." Rocco was quiet for a long moment. "An account in my brother-in-law's name," he said. "In Portugal." Silas made a small defeated sound and put his face in his hands. Several of the captains looked away, not out of sympathy, but out of the specific discomfort of watching a man arrive at the bottom of something. Bertelli was staring at the table. The man next to him had his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Caruso was looking at Rocco with the steady, sorrowful attention of an old man who had expected something like this to happen, eventually, and taken no satisfaction in being right. Dominic looked at Rocco across the table that had hosted 100 Sunday dinners, 100 casual conversations, 100 small moments of the kind that accumulate into what you call, without examining it too carefully, a relationship. "You're done here," Dominic said. Not shouted, not announced. Said, the way you say something that is simply, irrevocably true. Rocco stood up. He straightened his jacket with the deliberate precision of a man maintaining his physical dignity, because it is the only thing left that belongs entirely to him. He looked around the table at 8 men he had worked alongside for years, and found, in each face, some version of the same answer. He looked at Dominic last. He didn't say anything. Dominic didn't say anything. The space between them held what 12 years of proximity holds, not warmth, not anymore, but the weight of its absence, which is its own specific thing. Rocco walked to the door. He took his coat from the hook. He left. The door closed. The room held the silence for a moment, and in that silence 8 men breathed and adjusted and recalibrated in the ways that people do when the shape of their world has just been altered. Then Silas Trent, who had not moved and had not looked up from the table, said, "I want to cooperate." His voice was rough, shredded at the edges. The voice of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has just set it down in the worst possible way. "I know," Dominic said. "That conversation happens with lawyers present." Both sides. Silas nodded. He was still looking at the table. "How long?" Bertelli asked. Not to anyone specifically. To the room. 6 years, Caruso said, at least. Bertelli shook his head slowly. He was 29 years old, and this was the first time he had sat at this table for something like this. And the experience of it showed in his face the way things show in young faces before they learn to prevent it. 6 years, he said, as if saying it again made it more comprehensible. It didn't. Some things don't become more comprehensible with repetition. They just become more real. Dominic looked around the table. "The organization is not going to talk about this. Outside this room," he said. "Not to wives, not to associates, not to anyone who wasn't sitting here this morning. What happens legally happens legally. What happens inside these walls stays inside these walls. What I need from every person in this room is a decision about whether you're in or whether you're out. Not today. You have until the end of the week, but I need it because what comes next is a different version of this thing, and I'm only taking people into it who I know where they stand." The room processed this. Caruso nodded first, once. Slowly, the nod of a man for whom the answer was never in question. The others followed, in their own time, in the ways that fit each of them. Not all immediately. Not all without the visible work of a man thinking through what he's committing to. But one by one, around the table, the nods came. When the last one had come, Dominic stood. "Go home," he said. "I'll be in contact Monday." The room began to clear. Men picked up their coats and their copies of the documents, which they had been told to take with them, and filed out in the quiet, purposeful way of people carrying serious things. Bertelli was the last to leave. He paused at the door and turned back. "The wife," he said. Then, catching himself, "Celeste. She built all of this." "Yes," Dominic said. Bertelli looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of a young man reconfiguring something he thought he understood. "I didn't know she was He stopped. It didn't seem to have the right word. "Neither did I," Dominic said. Bertelli left. The dining room was empty. Dominic stood in it alone for several minutes. The coffee cups sat on the table with their varying levels of abandonment, some finished, some half-drunk, Silas's untouched. The document copies were gone. The hard-sided case sat open and empty beside his chair, the material that had been inside it now distributed into the world in ways that could not be recalled. He thought about Rocco walking to his car. He thought about the call Rocco was probably making right now to the attorney, to whoever he had positioned as his next move. He thought about the Portugal account and the brother-in-law whose name was on it, and the specific cold calculation of a man who had been managing his exit for long enough to have layered it with redundancies. The legal trap Celeste had built was already sprung. The filings were in. The evidence was moving through channels that operated on their own timeline now, independent of anything Rocco did in the next hour or the next day. He had prepared for exactly this. She had prepared for exactly this. Dominic picked up his phone. He called Celeste. She answered on the second ring. "It's done," he said. A pause. "Left. Silas is cooperating. Captains, most of them. The rest have until Friday. The documents are filed," she said. "I got confirmation an hour ago. The accounts connected to the Meridian structure are frozen. He won't be able to move what's left. He already moved $4 million to Portugal." "I know about the Portugal account," she said. And then, after a brief pause, "So does the firm handling the evidence. That information was in the package." He almost said, "Of course it was." Stopped himself. "What do I do now?" he asked instead. It was a genuine question. He hadn't asked a genuine question of another person in a very long time. He could feel it in the asking, the specific unfamiliarity of it, like a muscle used for the first time after a long disuse. Celeste was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "You rebuild," she said. "You do it differently this time. You promote the people you should have promoted years ago, and you stop listening only to the people who tell you what you want to hear." "And you?" Another pause. Longer. "I'll be building too," she said. "We'll be doing it in parallel, not together." He heard what she didn't say as clearly as what she did. Celeste, Dominic. Her voice was not unkind, it was something else. Something that had been measured and weighed and arrived at through a process that didn't have room in it for the complication of what he was about to try to say. "We did what needed to be done. Now we do what comes after it. That's where we are." He held the phone against his ear and stood in the empty dining room with the afternoon coming gray through the windows and the knowledge that she was right sitting in him, the way true things sit not comfortably, but solidly, with the specific unmovable quality of something real. "All right," he said. "I'll have my attorney send the divorce papers to Marcus by end of week," she said. "I'm asking for nothing that isn't already covered in the restructuring agreement. It should be straightforward." "All right," he said again. A silence that was not hostile and not comfortable but simply honest, which was he was beginning to understand the most they were going to get. "Take care of yourself," she said. She hung up. He stood there for another moment with the phone in his hand. Then he put it in his pocket and walked to the window that looked out onto the back garden, the same window he'd stood at the day before, watching the stone wall. The dried stems of the wild indigo were still there along the wall. In the flat November light they looked like nothing, like remnants, like the evidence of something that had been and was now only waiting. He knew better now. He knew they were doing what they always did, holding on through the cold, through the dormant season, through the long stretch of nothing that comes before the bloom, because that was their nature not to announce themselves, not to perform their survival, but to simply continue, underground and invisible, until the conditions were right. He had signed the restructuring documents yesterday and lost half of everything he'd built and exposed the man he'd trusted most as a thief and begun the legal dissolution of his marriage and stood in a room this morning and done it the right way. The contained, structured, legally defensible way that Celeste had spent 18 months designing for exactly this moment. He had done it. He had not done it the way he would have done it 2 years ago. He had done it the way a man does something, when he has finally, at considerable cost, learned to see the room he's actually standing in. Outside, the wind moved through the garden. The stems along the wall held, and Dominic Valenti stood at the window and understood, for the first time without flinching from it, what it meant that the most dangerous person in the room had never been the man everyone feared. It had been the woman who was patient enough to let them believe that. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The next chapter of his life was sitting somewhere in front of him, unwritten, waiting. He had no idea, yet, whether he was equal to it. But, for the first time in a very long time, the not knowing felt like an honest place to start rather than a weakness to conceal, and he held on to that the plain, uncomfortable, necessary honesty of it, the way a man holds onto the only solid thing in a room that is still shifting beneath him, waiting for the ground to find its level again. The divorce papers arrived at Marcus Webb's office on a Wednesday. Marcus called Dominic at 2 in the afternoon to tell him, using the same tone he used for all legal notifications, measured, factual, stripped of the editorializing that Dominic had never wanted and Marcus had never offered. The papers were clean, he said, straightforward the way Celeste had promised they would be. No contest on the restructuring assets, no additional claims. No language designed to wound beyond what was legally necessary. Kind of divorce, filing that a person produces when they have already done their grieving in private and arrived at the paperwork stage with nothing left to prove. Dominic told Marcus to review them and let him know if there was anything requiring his attention. Marcus said there wasn't. Dominic said he'd come in Friday to sign. He put the phone down and sat at his desk in the estate study, the same desk where he'd sat the night of the restaurant, with the untouched bourbon and the photograph in the drawer, and he looked at the wall across from him for a while without seeing it. Not thinking exactly. Something less organized than thinking. The mind moving through the space between what was and what was going to be, the way water moves through the space between two levels, not by choice, but by the simple physics of where things stand. The week since the Saturday meeting had been the busiest of his professional life, and the most structurally different. He had done what he told his captains he would do rebuilt, differently. He had promoted Danny Reese to a position of real operational authority, not because of the phone call on Friday morning, though that mattered, but because of the question Danny's phone call had answered about who in his organization was capable of bringing him uncomfortable truth without calculating whether the timing was advantageous. That was the quality he had spent his career undervaluing. He understood now how much it had cost him. He had released 4 men who had been positions of influence, primarily because they had been there a long time, and because their primary skill was the management of Dominic's comfort rather than the execution of anything that actually mattered. He did it without drama, without punishment, with the straightforward honesty of a man who has run out of patience for the particular kind of damage that comfortable mediocrity does to an organization over time. He had sat with each of the remaining senior captains individually, not in a group, not with an agenda, just the 2 of them and a table and enough time to say what needed to be said. Some of those conversations were difficult. 2 of them surfaced things he hadn't known and hadn't wanted to know and needed to know. He listened without interrupting, which was new for him and harder than it sounded. Caruso, in his individual meeting, had sat across from him and said, "You've been running this place, like a man afraid someone is going to take it from him." A pause. That fear is what let Rocco get close enough to steal from it. Dominic had sat with that statement for a long time before responding. "I know," he'd said. Caruso had nodded, with the slow gravity of a man who has been waiting years to say something and is relieved to have said it. "Good," he said. "Then we have somewhere to go from here." Rocco's legal situation was moving through channels that operated on their own clock. The evidence Celeste's firm had routed through independent legal counsel had been substantial enough that Rocco's own attorneys had shifted their strategy within the first week from aggressive challenge to quiet negotiation, which told Dominic everything he needed to know about how much the documentation held up under professional scrutiny. He received updates through Marcus. He did not seek additional information beyond what Marcus provided, because Celeste had built the mechanism, and he trusted the mechanism, and trust, actual trust, the functional kind, extended to the actual person who had earned it, was the thing he was actively practicing. The Portugal account, it turned out, had been tracked by sources Celeste's investigators had placed in the financial chain 18 months earlier. The $4 million was frozen within 72 hours of the Saturday meeting. Rocco's brother-in-law, reached by phone by an attorney whose call he apparently took without understanding who it was representing, had said a number of things that subsequently became part of the record. Dominic had not asked for details about that conversation. He didn't need them. Silas Trent cooperated fully, the way men cooperate when the alternative has been made clear, and the math has been done, and the answer keeps coming out the same. His cooperation added detail and context to the documentation, confirming several things Celeste had inferred from the financial records, and adding 2 things she hadn't known about a third shell company structure and a communication channel that had been used specifically to coordinate with Rocco around the timing of Dominic's most vulnerable financial moments, which was the detail that, when Marcus relayed it, landed the hardest. They had watched for his weakest moments. They had timed their extractions around them. He had not known. He sat with that for 3 days after Marcus told him. He carried it the way you carry something heavy when you're not sure yet whether to put it down or find somewhere, to store it with the physical awareness of its presence and the ongoing calculations of its cost. On the 4th day, he put it down, not because it stopped mattering, because he understood that carrying it served nothing beyond a certain point, and that there was too much in front of him, requiring his full attention to afford the ongoing weight of what he couldn't change. This was new for him, too, the deliberate, chosen putting down of things he couldn't alter. He was not naturally built for it. It required daily maintenance, The same way a newly healed injury requires deliberate care, not because the damage is still present, but because the habit of protecting it takes time to unlearn. He signed the divorce papers on Friday morning. Marcus had laid them out on the conference table in the same careful order he'd laid out everything. The man was constitutionally incapable of disorganization, which was one of the reasons Dominic had kept him for 19 years. 11 pages. Signatures and initials on the marked lines. It took 8 minutes. When he put the pen down, Marcus collected the documents without comment, which was the right thing to do. Dominic sat for a moment in the conference room with his hands flat on the table and looked at the middle distance. He thought about 14 months of courtship and a wedding at a restaurant in the West Village that Celeste had chosen, and he had arrived at 20 minutes late because of a phone call he hadn't been able to cut short. He thought about a hotel in the south of France where she'd laughed in the photograph. He thought about 12 years of dinners and the particular way she had of entering a room not with drama, not with announcement, but with the settled presence of someone who has decided to be fully where they are. He thought about an emerald dress and a black leather portfolio and a business card sliding across a white tablecloth. He thought about 4 words. You don't know her. He hadn't known her. He knew her now. And knowing her now, with the full clarity of everything that had happened, was its own specific grief, not the sharp kind, but the long, slow, permanent kind that comes from understanding exactly what you had at the moment you understand it's gone. He stood up. Thank you, Marcus, he said. Marcus looked at him over his reading glasses. For what specifically? For telling me the truth when it mattered. This year and the ones before it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You usually didn't want it, he said. No, Dominic said. I didn't. He left the office and walked out into the cold December air, which hit him the way cold air hits you when you've been inside for a long time, clarifying, almost harsh. The world asserting its actual temperature rather than the temperature you'd been insulated from. Paulo was at the curb. Dominic got in and said, "Take me to the estate," and sat with the city moving past the window all the way home. The estate was already listed with a real estate firm. He had made that decision 2 weeks after the Saturday meeting, not impulsively, but with the particular certainty of a man who has looked at something long enough to understand that its meaning has changed, and that living inside a changed meaning is its own kind of trap. He was buying a place in the city smaller, less symbolic, a building with a view of the river that he had looked at for 20 minutes during the showing and thought, yes, this is a place I can think. He had 1 week left in the estate. He spent the afternoon in his study dealing with the mundane administrative work that accumulated in a life like his correspondence, decisions that had been deferred, operational details that required his signature rather than a subordinate's. He worked until 6. He ate dinner alone, something Maria had left, sitting at the kitchen counter rather than the dining room, because the dining room felt, still, like a room where the furniture remembered Saturday morning. After dinner, he went to the garden. He had not been in the garden since the night of the restaurant, when he'd stood at the study window and looked at the stone wall through the glass. He stood in it now, actually in it, the cold coming up through the ground, the bare November branches of the old oak, at the far corner, making their angular shapes against a sky that was the particular dark gray of early December, and he walked to the wall where the wild indigo grew. It looked like nothing. Long, bare stems, dry and brown, the seed pods emptied months ago, the leaves long gone. No indication to anyone who didn't know of what the plant was or what it would do. It simply existed along the wall in its winter form, which was the form of absence, of dormancy, of the long patience required by things that cannot rush their own becoming. He stood there for a while. He thought about Celeste telling him they required years. He thought about the way he'd nodded without hearing her, because the phone call had seemed more important. He thought about all the things he had nodded at, without hearing in 12 years of a marriage he had been present for physically and absent from, in most of the ways that counted. He crouched down. He pressed 2 fingers against the base of one of the stems, where it met the ground. The stem was stiff, dry, utterly unimpressive. But at the base, where his fingers rested, the ground was not frozen yet, and if you pressed against the root, which he did gently. You could feel the slight resistance of something still alive in there, something still holding. He stayed crouched for a long moment. Then he stood up, and he looked at the wall, and he made a decision. He was going to leave the plants, not dig them up, not have the grounds crew clear them when the estate changed hands. He was going to ask the real estate firm to disclose to the buyers that the wild indigo along the south garden wall was established growth that bloomed in late spring, that it required nothing beyond patience, and that it was worth keeping. He didn't know if the new owners would keep it. That wasn't his to control. What was his was the decision to say it, to name what was worth something before he left, to not go without having said what deserved to be said. He went inside and sent the real estate agent an email about the plants. Then he made a phone call he had been composing in his head for 3 weeks. Vivian answered on the 4th ring, which told him she had seen his name and considered not answering and decided to answer any, which was its own kind of honesty that he respected. "Dominic," she said. "I know you're not expecting this call," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd make it." I wasn't sure either. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter where he'd eaten dinner an hour ago, looking at nothing in particular. "I'm not calling to explain. There's nothing to explain that isn't already obvious. I'm calling because you didn't deserve the situation I put you in, and I was using you for something that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with my own avoidance, and you should know that clearly." A silence. "Are you apologizing?" she asked, not sarcastically, genuinely asking. Another silence, longer. "Okay," she said finally. "I'm going to need some time to figure out what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "I just needed to say it." "That's very," she paused. "That's different from what I expected." "I've been trying to be different from what I was," he said. "I don't know yet how well it's working." She made a small sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. "I'm taking a position in Chicago," she said. "In January. Fresh start." "Good," he said, and meant it. "Dominic." Her voice had shifted to something more careful. "Was any of it, did it mean anything? Or was I just?" "It wasn't nothing," he said. "I want to be honest about that. But it wasn't what it should have been for you to be involved in it. Those two things are both true." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Take care of yourself in Chicago," he said. "You too," she said, and hung up. He set the phone down on the counter. He stood in the kitchen of the house where his marriage had lived and died, and let the quiet of it sit around him without trying to fill it. 3 weeks later, at a charity gala in Midtown, an annual event that his organization had sponsored for years, and that he attended the way he attended all such events, because presence at the right moments was part of the ongoing work of maintaining the legitimate face of the Valenti name. He saw Celeste. He knew she would be there. He had known before he arrived, because the gala's host committee listed her as a co-chair, which was information he had registered without deciding in advance what he was going to do with it. He had come anyway, not strategically. He had come because the work of living his life going forward required him to be in the same rooms as the world he was still part of, and Celeste Arden was now part of that world in a way that was distinct from the one where she had been his wife, and he needed to learn how to be in a room with that. He saw her from across the main floor. She was standing near the center of the room, which was not where she used to stand. She used to stand at the edges composed, watching the woman at the perimeter of her husband's professional world. She was standing at the center now, and the difference was not one of position, but of gravity. People were moving toward her, not performing attention at her, but actually oriented toward her, the way people orient toward someone they want to be near, someone whose presence in the room makes the room better, in some way they might not be able to articulate, but can feel clearly. She was wearing something deep blue. She was laughing at something a woman beside her had said, a real laugh, the tilted forward one he'd seen in the photograph from France, and the ease of it, the unperformed ease of a woman completely at home in her own life, was the most striking thing he'd seen in a very long time. He watched her for a while without approaching. Not covertly, there was nothing secretive about it. He simply watched, because there was something he needed to see from a distance, before he could see it up close, something about how she occupied this version of her life, This one that was entirely hers, built on foundations she had laid herself without him in the structure. She looked good in it. That thought arrived without bitterness, which surprised him. He tested it, poked at it, the way you poke at something to see if it's solid, and found that it was genuinely without bitterness, which meant something about where he'd arrived in the internal accounting of the last several months. He was glad she looked good in it. He was glad the life she'd built was large enough and real enough that her being in it showed on her. He crossed the room. She saw him coming from about 15 feet away. He watched her register him the slight adjustment in her posture, not defensive, just present in a new way, and say something brief to the woman beside her, who moved away with the tact of someone who has understood the room correctly. He stopped in front of her. Up close, she looked the same, and entirely different, the way people look when you've been seeing them one way for years and then see them without that frame. The same dark eyes, the same quality of density, of more behind them than she was showing. But something had lifted from around her that he hadn't known was there until it was gone, a held quality, a sustained effort, the invisible labor of a woman who had spent years managing the gap between what she knew and what she was allowed to say. She wasn't holding anything now. "Dominic," she said. "Celeste." He paused. "You look, you're exactly where you're supposed to be." She considered this. "I think I am," she said. Not with triumph. With the quiet honesty of someone who has earned the right to that statement. "The businesses," he said. "The transition, I wanted you to know it's gone well. The employees are stable. The operational side is running better than it was before." "I know," she said. "I get reports." Of course she did. "The Meridian case," he said. "I heard the filing was amended last week. My attorneys added 2 additional accounts to the documentation. It tightens the financial picture considerably." "Good." A silence that was not hostile and not nostalgic, but something in between those things. Something with its own texture that belonged specifically to 2 people who had shared a long time and were now learning what they were to each other when the shared time was past. "The estate sold," he said. "I heard. I left the Indigo," he said. She looked at him. A small thing moved in her face, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the moment before a feeling becomes an expression. "You left the Indigo," she repeated. "I told the agent to tell the buyers what it was, that it was worth keeping." She was quiet for a moment. "Did they keep it?" she asked. "I don't know yet. It's winter." "You can't tell in winter." She held his gaze for a moment, said it with the directness he had come to understand. Too late and not too late was one of the most distinctive things about her. Then she said, "That was a good thing to do." "I'm trying to do more of those," he said. He nodded it slowly. Not as acknowledgement of the statement, but as the assessment of someone who was weighing it against what she knew. He understood he was being weighed. He stood still for it. "Are you well?" she asked. The question direct and genuine, without the social gloss that makes such questions into pleasantries. "I'm learning to be," he said. "It's slower than I'd like." "It usually is. How are you?" She thought about it honestly, which was one of the things about her that he had never fully appreciated until the moment he had no right to it anymore. She actually thought before answering questions about herself, as if the answer deserved the same care she gave to everything else. "I'm very well," she said, genuinely. "The work is—" She paused, looking for the word. "It's mine. All of it. That's different than I expected, even knowing it would be different." "You built something real," he said. I didn't see it," he said. And then, because he had learned in the past several months the difference between acknowledging something and actually saying it, "I didn't look." That's the more accurate version. She held his gaze. "No," she said, "you didn't." The words were plain. No performance of hurt, no invitation to defend himself, no wounding beyond the simple factual weight of what was true. Just the statement, offered cleanly, received cleanly, lying between them for a moment before it settled into the space, where everything they'd said to each other over the preceding months had settled, not disappearing, but finding its level, becoming part of the permanent record of what this had been. He thought about saying something else. He thought about the things he'd composed in his head over the last 3 weeks, the more complete versions of what he'd said the night of the restaurant, the fuller accounting that he hadn't had the language for then and had been developing slowly since. He thought about all the things that were true and real, and that he carried every day in the specific way you carry the permanent consequences of your own choices. He didn't say them, not because they weren't real, because she already knew them, because saying them now, in this room, at this distance, would not be for her benefit, but for his a need for absolution that was his to manage, not hers to provide. I hope the next thing you build is exactly what you want it to be, he said instead. She looked at him for a long moment. I think it will be, she said. He nodded. Once. He started to turn away and then stopped, and turned back and looked at her with the directness he'd been practicing, the kind that doesn't flinch from the discomfort of being fully seen and fully honest at the same time. Celeste. She waited. I thought I was protecting you from my world, he said. I didn't understand. You were strong enough to build a world of your own. The room moved around them, the way rooms move conversation and sound, in the ordinary, beautiful noise of people gathered in a space, and Celeste Arden stood in the middle of it and looked at Dominic Valenti and let what he'd said exist for a moment without immediately processing it into something. Then her eyes softened, not all the way, not into warmth that didn't belong to this moment, but in the specific way that the eyes soften when a person hears something true that they waited a long time to hear and have moved far enough past the waiting that the hearing of it is both a relief and an ache simultaneously. I know, she said quietly. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded and turned and walked back across the room the way he'd come. He did not look back, not because he didn't want to, because some things are completed by the not looking, by the choice to let a moment be what it was without extending it past its natural edge. He had spent his life forcing things past their natural edges, holding on too long, controlling what should have been released, refusing the completion that comes from letting something be finished. He was done with that. He moved through the gala for another hour. He had conversations. He shook hands. He did the work that the evening required of him, and he did it with more presence than he usually brought to such events. Because presence was the thing, he was actively building the habit of being fully in the room he was in, rather than managing the room from behind the glass of his own preoccupations. At 10:30, he said his goodnights, and walked to the coat check, and collected his coat, and walked out into the December night, which was cold and clear, the kind of clear that follows a prolonged gray period, and feels almost personal in its brightness. Paolo was at the curb. Dominic got in. They drove in silence for a while, through the lit streets of the city at night. The particular beauty of it, the way light catches water and glass, and of old glass in the faces of old buildings and transforms them into something that looks, briefly, like it was designed for the looking. The apartment, Paolo said, which was the first thing either of them had said since Dominic got in the car. Yes, Dominic said. The new apartment. Smaller, quieter. The view of the river that had said yes to him on first sight. He had been living in it for 2 weeks, and it still felt new, the way things feel new when they're actually new, when you're building a relationship with a space from the beginning, rather than inheriting the weight of what the space has already held. He liked it. He was surprised to like it, because he had expected to feel the loss of the estate more than he did. And what he found instead was something closer to relief. The same relief he'd felt sitting with Celeste's restructuring documents and finding them sound, the specific relief of a structure that works because it was built correctly, rather than because it's being held up by sheer force of will. He arrived at the apartment at 11. He hung his coat. He poured a glass of water, not bourbon. He'd been drinking less, which had happened without a decision, simply as a byproduct of having less to anesthetize, and stood at the window that looked out over the river. The river at night was wide and dark and caught the city lights along its banks in a way that made them look like they were breathing. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the glass of water to reach room temperature, long enough for the events of the evening to settle into their proper perspective, not too large, not too small, exactly what they were. He thought about Celeste in the center of the room, with people moving toward her. He thought about her eyes softening. He thought about the wild indigo along the stone wall that was no longer his, holding in the cold and the dark and the long season of nothing. alive beneath the surface in ways that would not be visible until the conditions allowed. He thought about what Caruso had said. You've been running this place like a man, afraid someone is going to take it from him. He thought about Danny Reese, who had called him with uncomfortable truth at 6:15 on a Friday morning, because he understood that truth, delivered early, was worth more than comfortable silence delivered on schedule. He thought about Marcus, 19 years of telling Dominic what he needed to hear and absorbing, without complaint, the many times Dominic hadn't been ready for it. He thought about the men he'd promoted and the men he'd released and the captains who had sat in a room on a Saturday morning and received devastating information and chosen, one by one, to stay. He thought about Silas Trent looking at the table and saying, I want to cooperate in the voice of a man who has run out of other options and has chosen, at the last available moment, the one that costs him the most, and is still somehow the right one. He thought about Rocco walking out of the estate with his coat over his arm, and his dignity maintained by the narrowest possible margin, which was all the dignity you had left when you'd spent 6 years stealing from the person who trusted you most. He thought about Vivian in a Chicago he hadn't seen yet, building something that was entirely hers, carrying her own portion of the accounting, and doing with it what people do the daily, unglamorous work of continuing. He thought about 12 years, about what they had contained and what they had failed to contain, and what they had built in the gaps between the two. About the specific way time feels when you look back at it, with the full knowledge of how it ended not wasted exactly, because nothing that teaches you something this large is entirely waste, but marked. Permanently marked by the shape of what you failed to understand while you were inside it. He turned from the window. He went to his desk, a smaller desk than the one at the estate, plainer, good wood, but without the weight of the other, and he sat down and opened the notebook where he had, over the past several weeks, been writing things down. Not formally, not as any kind of diary, which was not a thing he had ever been capable of. More as a record of decisions, of what he intended, of the specific commitments he was making to himself, because he had learned, the hard way, that the commitments you don't articulate are the ones you most easily abandon when the moment of inconvenience arrives. He wrote 3 sentences. Then he closed the notebook and sat in the quiet of his apartment, with the river beyond the window doing what rivers do, moving, constantly and without drama, in the direction they have always been moving, shaped by what they run over and carrying it forward, the way everything carries forward what it has passed through. He was 51 years old, and he was beginning again. Not from nothing. He was not naive enough, and had not been through enough, to use the word nothing for what he was starting from. He was starting from the complicated, imperfect, sometimes shameful and sometimes genuine truth of everything that had brought him to this window on this night. And that was the only honest starting point available to a person who has actually lived something rather than imagined living it. In the spring, he heard from the estate's new owners through the real estate agent. They had kept the wild indigo. It had begun to bloom along the south wall blue. The agent's message said, the way spring things are blue, startlingly blue, the color of something that has waited long enough and is no longer waiting. Dominic read the message twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and walked out of his office and down the hall and into the meeting, where his day was waiting for him, carrying that small fact blue, blooming, kept in the part of himself where he put the things that mattered without requiring him to explain why. Inside the Valenti organization, in the years that followed, a particular pattern established itself. Whenever a new associate or a junior captain said something dismissive about Celeste Arden, about the divorce, about her role, about the woman who had walked away from Dominic Valenti's world and built her own, the comment was met with a silence from the direction of Dominic that was itself a kind of instruction. Then quietly, he would end the conversation with 4 words. You don't know her. Not as eulogy, not as regret performed for an audience. As fact. The plainest available fact, offered to a room that needed to understand it. Because once, he hadn't known her either, and the price of learning who she truly was had been everything he thought he was protecting by not looking. He paid that price every day. Not with suffering, he was not a man who had any patience left for performed suffering, his own or anyone else's. But with the daily, deliberate, sometimes difficult choice to see the rooms he was actually in, to hear the things people were actually saying, to extend the specific attention that the people around him deserved, and that he had spent too many years distributing only to the things he had already decided mattered. It was the most demanding thing he had ever done. It was also, in the plain unglamorous way of things that are true, the work that finally made him someone worth the room he stood in. Celeste Arden built her empire the way she had always built everything, patiently, precisely, without announcement, until the day the world looked up and found it already there, fully formed, exactly as large as she had always intended. She never returned to him. Some things once completed do not require a coda. Some prices once paid are simply the shape of what came after. And some gardens bloom in the hands of strangers, indifferent to who planted them, faithful only to the slow turning of seasons. They were always going to survive.